Hey there, folks. The Infinite Jukebox, rest in peace, Steve Albini, here with another episode of the Rapid Record Recap. What is the Rapid Record Recap? You may be asking. It is a monthly series that I do on my channel where I talk about all of the albums that I heard in the previous month, that I had thoughts on, that I had opinions on, that I formulated, that I didn't get time to review. Maybe it's because I didn't hear about them until it was too late for me to review them. Or maybe I just had some thoughts on them, but not enough to warrant a full 15 to 20 minute long review. Either which way, it's a video. I talk about a bunch of albums, and this is the April 2024 edition of the Rapid Record Recap. So here we go. Ugly, Twice Around the Sun. I find it weird when people say stuff like the whole UK art rock boom kind of peaked a couple years ago thanks to bands like Black Country New Road and Black Midi, among various others, but I don't know. I find that kind of hard to say. I mean, sure, there isn't some sort of, like, standout name right now that debuted this year so far, at least, that really makes me want to 100% disagree, but when you got bands like English Teacher, or in this case, Ugly, coming out of the woodwork at a relatively fast pace, I don't know. I find it hard to agree with that. Ugly kind of seemed like an unoriginal band upon first glance, with a lot of the very lush and grand influences going on here being actually somewhat common among most of their peers, if I'm being totally honest, to varying extents at least. But it's a lot of the smaller details that they change up in that sound that make them so unique, whether it's the combined vocal performances or the way that there's nice punch of the bass in certain moments that you don't really expect. And, I mean, hey, at 36 minutes, this is basically a full-length album, almost, even though it's technically an EP. And I think as a whole, Ugly really do get to demonstrate the abilities that they have here. They are very strong instrumentalists, they are solid songwriters, they have a lot of really impressive dramatic moments and passages throughout this record, and the album closing track, I'm Happy You're Here, kind of ends things off really nicely on this odd note that feels kind of uncomfortable but peculiar in a very pretty but semi-abstract kind of way. It's a track that definitely stands out here, something hard to describe but absolutely worth listening to if this does kind of sound like your thing. So do with that information what you will, but personally, I enjoyed this one a lot. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Khruangbin, Alla Sala. I'm not gonna lie, I kind of think that this one's just sort of nothing. I mean, this isn't a bad band at all. Khruangbin have put out some solid material in the past. It's just, I feel that this is sonically pleasant, but sort of just one meandering jam after the next that doesn't really go anywhere or do much for me personally, and I don't really walk away from anything here with anything in mind in particular. Just a very middle of the road record, maybe one of the single most indifferent albums that I've heard all year, and I'm mainly covering it because I mean, it's a relatively big album. I feel like I kind of have to cover it, or like, I don't know, maybe someone will yell at me in the comments. I'm very afraid of people on the internet. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Conan Gray, Found Heaven. I don't think anyone is super shocked that some artists like Conan Gray and various other artists whose careers were kind of born via TikTok, to an extent at least, have fallen off as quickly as they have. I mean, Conan's still very successful, just not 500 million streams per song successful. But yeah, I do respect that this record tries to be creative with its sort of new wave influences going on, but I don't know, nothing stands out here to me. With the vocals, no melodies really stick out to me. The instrumentals don't really have anything going for them. They don't lean enough into the nostalgia, but they also don't do anything creative enough to feel like they aren't just relying on intentionally outdated synth pop kind of sounds at times. I mean, I will say that this is more of a creative leap for Conan than I think most other artists within the general ballpark that Conan is in would take, but I don't know. I don't really think that this is a super impressive record in really any regard. Just, again, a very middling album that almost feels oddly reflective of the decline of many different artists who have kind of blown up on social media in the last couple of years, gained a fairly dedicated fan base, and then fallen off deeply while still being relatively successful, albeit in kind of their own corner. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Eunuchs, Harbour Century. This is a super cool avant-prog kind of record for sure, with some symphonic elements kind of mixed in there. And while I would say that musically this isn't super different from another avant-garde progressive rock band kind of out there right now, of which there are many, I think that's lyrically extremely unique and instrumentally executed pretty virtuosically overall. I mean, start it for some solid jazz-influenced prog, stay for Enzo's unhinged vocals, as well as the 20-minute album closer Heroin King, which is easily the biggest highlight on the record for me. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. J. Cole, might delete later. Oh boy. You know what's funny? I have to kind of break the fourth wall here. In front of me at pretty much all times, notes of these albums for the Rapid Record Recap, just so I can remember what I say. Not full written reviews, but I write down little things that I want to say, maybe like a quip or two I want to make. And it's so weird looking at these right now because a lot of them just feel irrelevant at this point with the connection that this has to Kendrick Lamar and the ongoing Kendrick-Drake beef. Might Delete Later feels like it was something released decades ago at this point, even though it just literally came out last month. And I guess I'll just say this, considering 7 Minute Drill got almost immediately taken off of streaming, I think the title aged remarkably well, extremely quickly, and I don't know, this is just... it's hard to describe. I mean, the tape opens with a Rick and Morty line, and as someone who has a tragic amount of videos on this channel within the first year of me wearing Rick and Morty shirts in a vain attempt to be funny, ironically, that's just rough, man. And I mean, honestly, the majority of the record is produced well enough, but I don't know, it just has some cringeworthy references constantly coming from a variety of directions, some weak features from people like Cameron and Central C, which I really think is just reflective of how few people were on J. Cole's side during this entire time. When you had to rely on a Cameron feature to get by here, that's brutal. I just think as a whole, the lyrics range from bland filler to a lot of very poor attempts for Cole to make himself look like he's in his prime when I think it's kind of universally agreed upon he's in his fall-off era, for lack of a better term. And there's just so many bizarre moments here, like the very now infamous trans fella line talking about Kendrick Lamar. Like, what? Like, someone said that you suck and you're a bum, and the first thing you say is, oh, I'm sensing hints of a trans fella. Like, even ignoring the whole Dave Chappelle connection and the general vibe of that line, it just doesn't make any sense. It's just dumb. I mean, you can say that about a lot of things relating to J. Cole, but that's just stupid. This album is pretty nonsensical in general, honestly. This album just aged poorly the second that it dropped, honestly. I mean, between Cole going into ramblings about things that have kind of nothing to do with anything, or him talking about how he's still on top when I don't think he's ever had less hype surrounding him in terms of new releases, it's just a very poorly aged tape, sort of like milk left out in the middle of summer. But you know, at the same time, it's not horrifically bad, it's just regular bad, and I think most of the instrumentals are fine. It's just the songwriting is a landfill of weak disses and assorted other bars with the occasional bit of bigotry sprinkled in just for funsies, I guess. I'm going to give this record 2 stars out of 5. This is just a bad tape, man. The Black Keys, Ohio Players. Look, it's the Black Keys. I don't think I really need to say that it's not super original. They've never really been the most original band. They just pulled it off better at a very different point in time. But that being said, there are some notable bits of energy here that you don't see on most of their recent releases, even if it's a slight step down from Dropout Boogie at the end of the day. I think that the psychedelic tones you get in some tracks like Read 'Em and Weep is cool, and the features from people like Beck and Juicy J and Lil Noid, of all people, are kind of wild in concept, albeit fairly tame in execution, shockingly. It's pretty uninteresting, and it's just the Black Keys, and it's not the worst band to be, I guess. It just isn't also the best band to be by far, actually. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Pharrell Williams / Virginia, I guess, Black Yacht Rock Volume 1, City of Limitless Access. It feels very weird to say that Pharrell Williams' best album in a long while is a record that barely anyone cared about, a record that I've only been able to listen to on YouTube, but I mean, hey, it's true, because this is a really great take on that very classic R&B kind of sound, with his notably modernized production to really keep it rooted in the present day without fully going for the nostalgia bait, still balancing a fair degree of nostalgia to make this record what it is at the end of the day, but overall, it does feel like a true Pharrell Williams album. It just feels like his own unique take on a very specific time period in a specific genre of music, and I mean, it's a good take on it overall. I can't really complain about it. 1111 has this cool funk vibe going for it. Going Back to VA is this breezy summer vibe kind of song, and I think that his vocal performances, with their lack of range, make up for it by being extremely charismatic, though that has kind of always been a selling point of his music in the first place, so I guess that's to be expected. But my point is that overall, this album doesn't get to overstay its welcome. It's under 30 minutes. It's a fun little record. It's short, it's sweet. I think it demonstrates why Pharrell is such a beloved figure in the first place, being able to take an entire sound and kind of mold it into his own creative vision. And while I don't think it's a magnum opus slice of genius or anything like that, I think it's a really good album, and I do think that you should go out of your way to listen to this, even if it's not on streaming services. I mean, if you refuse to listen to music because it's not on streaming services, you're kind of a dork anyway, but especially with this record, I think you should go check it out. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Maggie Rogers, Don't Forget Me. This is a step up from her mediocre sophomore studio album Surrender back in 2022 for sure. I mean, not a huge step up, but I think there's a pretty notable difference. The ballad tracks I still do continue to find myself disinterested in, but at the same time, a lot of the melodies here are stronger than they really ever have been before in her discography anyway, and I think in particular songs like Drunk really do highlight how great of a composer she can be from a song progression standpoint, and I also like some of the more pop, country, folk kind of rock influenced cuts where everything is sort of fused together at the same time. I think it makes for songs like Never Going Home that are ultimately pretty engaging songs overall. I think there's enough weak material here that holds it back from being a really striking record, but on the flip side, I think that there's some of Maggie Rogers' best material to date here. So as a whole, I can say that I do thoroughly enjoy this one, even if I do think it's pretty imperfect. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Still House Plants. If I Don't Make It, I Love You. This one got a good bit of hype around it, which was kind of nice to see, honestly, because as far as sort of music nerd adjacent albums go, the kind of records that appeal to that sort of audience, the audience that admittedly I'm in, this is probably one of the most out there I've heard so far this year, even if it isn't one of my favorite. I mean, there's a sort of Trout Mask Replica-esque quality about this record where every performer feels independent in their own respective way, but at the same time, everything comes together to make something that feels simultaneously a complete mess and also extremely cohesive in a way that I just feel is very difficult to capture. And while there are some moments here that don't really click with me a ton, I think the last couple of tracks don't really stick the landing in the same way that those that came before them did. I think that this is a pretty unique album. I think the closest you can come to really comparing it to something is maybe some no-wave records out there, but between some pretty intense vocal work, some very strange instrumental directions being taken, I think that this is probably one of the most interesting sort of experimental records that you'll get from a band that has reached a somewhat wider audience this year so far. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Replicant, Infinite Mortality. The third full-length studio album from experimental American death metal band Replicant, and it's probably their best to date. I think that there's a lot of really interesting compositions here, a lot of very dissonant moments that'll definitely appeal to those of you watching who are into the more avant-garde side of extreme metal, which includes myself, and a pretty interesting sort of decaying atmosphere that definitely suits the overall tone of the record, instrumentally and atmospherically. I mean, I won't pretend that there aren't other bands out there that do, at least to an extent, sound like this record, but I think that this record pulls off this, again, sort of avant-garde, dissonant death metal sound extremely well for what it's worth, and I think it's something definitely worth checking out if that's something that appeals to you, because, I mean, it's something that appeals to me, and I checked it out, and, I mean, hey, I enjoyed it. I'm including it in this video, aren't I? I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Shabaka, Perceive Its Beauty acknowledge its grace. Whether you associate him with Sons of Kemet, The Comet is Coming, London Brew, or Melt Yourself Down, there's pretty much no denying that Shabaka is technically one of the most notable leading figures within modern jazz, mainly due to his ties to so many essential projects. And here he is back with his first proper album as a sort of band leader, his first proper solo studio album since 2020's We Are Sent Here by History. And I mean, hey, it's pretty solid overall. I mean, there are some passages that admittedly lose me, like the last quarter of the track I'll Do Whatever You Want, or the shorter tracks that only go on for a few minutes a pop, but as a whole, I feel like this is a pretty atmospheric and engaging record, a really nice and mellow soundscape with some welcome features from people like Elucid and Moses Sumney, among others, and it's especially worth checking out if new age sort of atmospheric jazz is something, especially in your wheelhouse, something that really deeply interests you in particular. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Baby Rose and Bad Bad Not Good. Slow Burn. Soul R&B performer Baby Rose collaborating with jazz experimentalist Bad Bad Not Good to kind of create this very smooth, pleasant little EP here. It's super accessible, but at the same time never compromises the integrity of the performance to do so, and I think the main highlight here is, of course, Baby Rose herself. She delivers some gorgeous vocal performances throughout this whole entire thing, but Bad Bad Not Good as a band does shine here a good bit as well. They play very appropriately, they don't go beyond their own means as a attempt to sort of show off or anything like that. They just back up Baby Rose excellently, and I think it leads to this sort of jazzy, smooth soul kind of sound that there is a lot of out there, but Slow Burn is put together so well that it's kind of hard to not appreciate it and enjoy it, and that isn't to mention that it does kind of warrant re-listens exclusively due to the fact that it is so easily enjoyable and it's so brief that it's very easy to return to. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Future and Metro Boomin, We Still Don't Trust You. I feel like this album got pretty heavily overshadowed after its initial drop, mainly due to the fact that it was directly connected to the original We Don't Trust You, which it in and of itself was directly connected to the Drake and Kendrick Lamar beef going on right now. That's pretty much overshadowed everything in mainstream rap at the moment, but there's also the fact that We Still Don't Trust You is also just a decent step down from its predecessor. Not enough that it's weak, it's still a solid record, but I will say that there are some throwaway tracks here. There's some weak beats, like Red Leather, for example, being this sort of very stock-sounding instrumental that's surprising to hear from Metro of all people, but Future actually sounds pretty consistently tight here throughout the entirety of the record, constantly engaged with the instrumentals, doing a variety of different flows at different points, kind of conveying a variety of different tones. I think that he actually does extremely well here, and it's nice to see him continue the strength of his performance on his last record into this one. And I don't mean to completely just throw away Metro as a producer either. He does provide some really strong beats here, tracks like This Sunday, for example, and there are some chill features here too, like The Weeknd on Always Be My Fault, kind of adding his sort of nocturnal R&B vibes that he's known for at this point, or A$AP Rocky later on Show of Hands. But then again, you also got Lil Baby, Ty Dolla $ign appearing on separate tracks. They don't really add a ton to the record. They both just are very mediocre, and the album is pretty bloated too, though maybe not as bloated as it would initially seem when you look at it at first. I just feel like a few tracks being cut off this would have done it a lot of good personally, but overall, it's less essential than the original album that it acts as the sequel to, but with that being said, it's still solid. I would recommend it if you liked its predecessor. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. High on Fire, Cometh the Storm. High on Fire are one of the most consistently great metal bands out there today, and I don't really think that's a super hot take to present. I mean, their latest effort continues their streak of greatness. Amazing riffs, amazing solos, the percussion is tight, and especially raw in places like Tough Guy and the title track, with some amazing bass tones like on the album opener, Lamb's Bread, one of my favorite songs that High on Fire has ever put out. Just it's the good stuff right there, and the more fast-paced tracks like The Beating are nice to see too, it's kind of seeing as the band sort of maintain their signature sort of stoner sludge throughout, even in those more fast-paced moments. It's just one of the most consistent metal albums of the year so far, no question, and definitely a must-hear, even if it isn't hugely different from High on Fire's other works. It manages to just be consistently strong, consistently impactful, consistently heavy and dense, and I don't see how you would not enjoy this if you were a big sort of like stoner metal kind of fan. This is pretty phenomenal stuff, as is most everything that the band has put out to date. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. Pearl Jam, Dark Matter. Pearl Jam are probably tied with Aerosmith for my personal pick of the most overrated rock band of all time to be considered and genuinely actually obtaining legendary status. And if I'm being completely honest, excluding the sort of laughingstock bands like Creed and Nickelback, I think that Pearl Jam were one of the most outright milquetoast mainstream rock bands to come out of the 90s, on the same level as, or at times maybe even more so than bands like Bush and Silverchair, and I think that's pretty much reflected here. This is just one overproduced riff after another, just a bunch of forced, overly wannabe emotional vocals from Eddie Vedder, easily one of the most overrated frontmen in the history of popular music. He just sounds like a dreary, boring crooner on the slower tracks, especially, and as a whole, this album just bores me to tears, and I don't think that Pearl Jam have ever outright angered me, but they make up for it in being one of the most aggressively nothing bands I've ever heard in my entire life, and Dark Matter, more like, doesn't matter to me, because I don't like it that much at all, actually. I'm going to give this record 2 stars out of 5. Cloud Nothings, Final Summer. Very fine offering here from Cloud Nothings, who kind of seem to get more melodic with each passing record, this one having a lot of very nice power pop tendencies to kind of go with it, a lot of very power pop oriented emo influences sort of strewn about, and it leaves me liking this album a lot. It's got a lot of good hooks, it's got a lot of great melodies, it's pretty memorable, it doesn't overstay its welcome, it's just a memorable, energetic album from a notably consistent band that has kind of outranked a lot of their peers in general in terms of still being a pretty good to great band on average now in 2024. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Machine Girl, Super Freak EP, because it's like frequency, freak with it. It's a Q. Onto the EP. I've seen this EP be slightly polarizing, seeing as it's the first new music that we've gotten from Machine Girl in a couple of years now, so obviously it wasn't going to be everybody's expectations, especially those who wanted a full-length LP, but I don't know, personally, I really enjoy this one. I'd say it's even one of the better EPs that I've heard so far this year. The sort of melodic, synth-punky sort of vibes of Black Glass and Dance in the Fire kind of just really bringing this high energy that, I expect from Machine Girl, but definitely presented in a different way than we've seen from this project in the past, and these sort of psychedelic breaks on the EP closer, Big Time Freak, are really fantastic, and this way, it kind of becomes this really short, sweet listening experience. This may be an EP in relation to a cyberpunk manga that I know literally nothing about, but I feel like even connections to other outside media completely disregarded. I think that this is a really strong EP. It's nice to see Machine Girl back. I think that this is a really interesting sound for the Machine Girl name, and I'm excited to see whatever comes next, because I think that there's some really fun, strong material here. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Melvins, Tarantula, Heart. Solid record here from cult legends, the Melvins, a band who I simultaneously managed to absolutely adore and not have a ton of interest in at the same time. On one hand, they have some amazing records, some truly astounding pieces of metal that are heavier than some of the most extreme metal that I think you could have accessed in the 80s and 90s, purely based on the rawness of their sound alone, and they continued that consistent excellency into the 2000s with records like A Senile Animal, but then again, they've kind of been on a run of mediocrity roughly since A Senile Animal, with very few highlights to be found anywhere in there until now, with this record being a solid, albeit kind of imperfect record that takes up some more industrial sounds that you don't constantly see from them, which I think is pretty cool to see on a full-length record. The album opener, Pain Equals Funny, does kind of overstay its welcome with a nearly 20-minute runtime, but the rest of the record is strong across the board, and I like the guitar work in Allergic to Food a lot in particular. It feels like a very odd song, even by Melvins standards, and they're just as idiosyncratic now as they were in the 80s, as they were in the 90s, and I gotta commend them for that, especially when it leads to solid late career albums like this. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Taylor Swift, The Tortured Poets Department. I'm gonna make this as quick as possible. Look, this album's bad. It's not good. It's one of the worst albums I've heard so far this year, but I think most of the issues that I've had with this record, you've probably heard a million times over because, God, I don't think it's a hot take when I say that this album and its presence in mainstream pop culture has been so wildly oversaturated. Why? The song progressions all sound the same, the instrumentals are wildly lifeless and predictable, and there are some really bad lines in here, some really awful lyrics I'm sure you're aware of. The Charlie Puth line on the title track with the bars of chocolate, the my friends they all smell like weed or little babies line on Florida, which has Florence and the Machine on it for some godforsaken reason. The I wish I could live in the 1830s, but without all the racist line on I hate it here, so on. So many horrible lyrics that are so faux poetic. You can tell that this record was trying to capture something more singer-songwriter-y, for lack of a better term. You can tell even in the title of this record it was going for that, and the result is something that feels so poorly thrown together, so poorly written. It feels like, I don't know, like a baby's first attempt at writing poetry of any kind and putting it to music, and that's awful to say when it's the single most popular pop star on the entire planet right now. It's boring, it's drab, it's dreary, it's nothing. It's the definition of everything wrong with all of these soulless pop singer-songwriter types like Taylor Swift, like Ed Sheeran, like Louis Capaldi, like Sam Smith, and even fittingly Charlie Puth, among others. I don't think this was the worst album of the year, but I think it's up there. And interestingly, there's an argument to be made that thanks to Reputation, it's not even the worst Taylor Swift album, which is kind of impressive, I guess, but I think for the most part it just goes to show that while I will defend some of her work from like other music nerds who tend to write off her entire discography, when she's bad, she's pretty awful. I say this as someone that didn't hate Midnights either. This is genuinely terrible. I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5. I'm sure you could probably tell it was within that range though. Lucy Rose, This Ain't the Way You Go Out. I think that some of the more percussion-heavy kind of cuts here are what stand out to me the most. The songs here like Life's Too Short and The Racket kind of being the highlights for me. I like the sort of jazzy influence that they take up when they have, again, those drums kind of more placed in the center of the sound overall, kind of higher in the mix overall. And I'll admit that some of the slower cuts, they don't really do it for me exactly, even if the songwriting is pretty consistently strong overall. But at the same time, I feel like Rose doesn't necessarily have the most unique voice in terms of actual songwriting and also in terms of her actual voice in the current realm of singer-songwriter types out there. So, I mean, yeah, overall, not blown away by this one, but I think there's a lot of potential here, and it does have its highlights, so I can say that I did genuinely enjoy it. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. St. Vincent, All Born Screaming. Man, this one's getting way overhyped. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not the worst album in the world, but there's some real bad moments here. I mean, for the most of the record, it kind of sounds like she's trying to do this sort of like kind of bad PJ Harvey impression, this sort of husky alt-rock impression on songs like Flea and Sweetest Fruit, and I think the weakest song by far is the pretty polarizing track, as I mentioned, Sweetest Fruit, with its first verse being this tribute to the late great Sophie, one of the greatest electronic producers of all time at this point, in my opinion. And it just feels misguided at best. I mean, I'm sure there is genuine admiration for Sophie coming from St. Vincent on that track, but admitting that you never knew her and then using a song to call her My Sophie is just off to me in the first place. And then after that, just having the verse be about how she died is bizarre. I don't necessarily see it as a tribute. I see it as a very analytical description of how Sophie passed away. There's just a very slight romanticization of her very tragic death, and no real admission of love for any of the music that she made, any of the impact that she had on the music industry, in the artistic world. It just feels like an odd moment for me, and I mean, I'm not a fan of a lot of this record in terms of songwriting in general, if I'm being honest. I will say there are some interesting moments here. This record isn't without its good qualities. The sort of neo-noir, trip-hoppish kind of vibes on Violent Times, maybe the best song on the record there, or the kind of rock-steady, sort of unexpected rhythm that you get on the track So Many Planets. They're interesting moments, interesting influences. They make this record stand out in the St. Vincent catalog for sure. There's no denying that, but as a whole, I just don't find much to connect with here, and I think that this is one of the least interesting albums that she's put out to date, which is kind of odd because it almost seems like the general consensus is the opposite, but it just doesn't click with me, I guess. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Justice, Hyperdrama. Justice are electronic legends for their classic debut album Cross alone. And that's a good thing because the rest of their discography is not good at all. I mean, the rest of their discography pretty infamously does not stack up to Cross, and I wanted to give this record a chance. I really wanted this to be the sort of comeback record, you know. I know that's been a very long time since that album, but still, I was just hoping for this moment where Justice make this big comeback in the sort of very French take on sort of electro dance music that you get, that sort of electro disco sort of sound that they've been known for over time. It just kind of came back in full force, and they made this brilliant album, and instead it isn't. It's not bad or anything, and some stuff like the Tame Impala collab, Never Ender, is cool, but, you know, as a whole, I can't help but feel like this is a pretty flat, kind of at times overproduced record that especially falls off at the end as things begin to feel almost consistently lacking in memorability, and I wanted to love this album, but really, I just don't. I just don't. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Darkthrone, It Beckons Us All. Look, I like Darkthrone's classics as much as the next black metal fan, and I personally don't mind the sort of more Black Doom fusion that they've been doing lately, but this is a really weak take on it. I don't find the riffs that memorable, the vocals leave a lot to be desired, and some tracks like And In That Moment I Knew the Answer, as well as the album closer, The Lone Pines of the Lost Planet, greatly overstay their welcome to the point that I really want to skip them if it weren't for the fact that I would feel bad if I did. And the sound is basically Celtic Frost worship, and I think that most people, including Darkthrone themselves, probably recognize that, and it's been done by countless bands, but an old school sound can still be good and even fresh if pulled off well, but I just think this is unfortunately some of Darkthrone's weakest material, at least in this realm, to date. I mean, hopefully it's all up from here. I'm going to give this record 2 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of the Rapid Record recap for this month, for April of 2024. Pretty solid month for music overall, you know? Some cool stuff came out. I enjoyed a lot of stuff. My favorite album of the year so far came out. That, of course, being the Darkthrone album that I just talked about, the best thing I've heard all year by far. And as a whole, I will say that I kind of hope that May results in some better albums. But as a whole, April was a pretty solid month. That's everything that I heard last month that I had some thoughts on that I wanted to convey in the Rapid Record recap. If there's a major album from last month that I didn't cover here, chances are that I covered it in a full-length video, so go and search for that on my channel page if you really want to see. But with that being said, that is the end of this video. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I will see you in the next one.